Layne Staley had been silent for 2 weeks before anyone realized it. April 2002. The Seattle rain softened against the glass, but inside apartment 102, time had stopped. A game console blinked in the dark. A photo of a woman watched from the nightstand, the air thick with the smell of something final. When the police finally broke down the door, the silence greeted them first. Outside, spring was blooming. Inside, the voice that once tore through amplifiers had gone still. Layne Staley, the man who sang about being trapped in a box, had finally found the quiet he'd been chasing his whole life. 45 pounds. That's all that remained of a man who had once commanded stages, whose voice had defined a generation's pain. Investigators would later determine he died on April 5, 2002. The same date Kurt Cobain had died 8 years earlier. The universe had a cruel sense of symmetry, but to understand why Layne Staley died alone in a darkened apartment, we must first understand how a boy from Washington became the voice of a generation's despair. We must travel back to a time before the addiction, before the fame, before the voice that could make beauty out of agony. The year was 1967. Kirkland, Washington, a suburb of Seattle where the rain fell like a constant conversation between sky and earth. Layne Thomas Staley was born into a working-class family, the kind where love was present but complicated, where divorce would later fracture the foundation, where a sensitive boy learned early that the world could hurt you in ways you couldn't articulate. Could their early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs or tragedies? For Layne, growing up in the Pacific Northwest in the 1970s and 80s created a fundamental understanding of isolation as a natural state. Seattle rain teaches you that some things just are. Gray skies, wet streets, a pervasive melancholy that settles into your bones. Layne absorbed all of it, became fluent in the language of sadness before he had words for what he was feeling. But he also discovered music, not as escape exactly, but as translation. He could take the feelings he couldn't speak and turn them into sound. His voice, even young, had a quality that stopped people. Rich, powerful, haunting. He sang in school bands, garage bands, any band that would let him stand at a microphone and transform pain into something beautiful. In high school, he formed a funk metal band called Sleaze, all teenage energy and ambition without direction. Then came Alice in Chains, a clever play on words that would eventually drop the possessive and become Alice in Chains. The name itself was prophetic. A woman bound, trapped, unable to escape. Layne didn't know yet that he was naming his own future. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? In 1987, Layne met Jerry Cantrell, a guitarist with a gift for heavy, melodic riffs that sounded like Seattle weather, beautiful and oppressive simultaneously. They recognized something in each other, a shared understanding of darkness as a creative force. Jerry wrote music that sounded like the inside of depression. Layne sang like a man who lived there. He didn't perform pain, he translated it. Alice in Chains was formed officially in 1987, and by 1990 they had released their debut album, Facelift. The single released from it would define them, a song about being trapped, suffocated, buried alive while still breathing. It climbed the charts, and suddenly Layne Staley was at the center of a musical movement that would come to be called grunge. But calling it grunge missed the point. This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. This wasn't punk's anger or metal's aggression. This was honesty so raw it felt like violence. Seattle in the late 80s and early 90s was a city of outcasts and introverts. People who felt too much and said too little until someone gave them guitars and amplifiers. Layne became the voice of that feeling, not the loudest voice, not the angriest, but perhaps the most honest. He existed in a constellation of pain alongside Kurt Cobain, Chris Cornell, and Eddie Vedder. They knew each other, these Seattle prophets, recognized each other as fellow travelers through darkness. Kurt was explosive. his pain manifesting as rage and noise. Chris was operatic, turning suffering into soaring vocals. Eddie was political, channeling pain into activism. Layne was internal, his agony collapsing inward like a dying star, creating a gravity that pulled listeners into his darkness. There's a famous story about Layne and Kurt running into each other at a party in 1992, both already deep into their respective addictions. They talked for hours in a corner, ignoring everyone else, two men who understood each other completely without needing to explain. When Kurt died in 1994, Layne didn't speak publicly about it. Friends say he became quieter after that, as if Kurt's death confirmed something Layne had always suspected about the price of honesty. His partnership with Jerry Cantrell was the creative engine of Alice in Chains, but it was also complicated. Jerry wrote most of the music and many of the lyrics, but it was Layne's voice that transformed those songs into something transcendent. They needed each other, Jerry's guitar providing the architecture, Layne's vocals providing the soul. But as Layne's addiction worsened, the partnership strained under the weight of watching someone you love destroy themselves while being unable to stop them. Jerry would write songs about Layne's addiction, hoping music might reach him when words couldn't. Layne would sing them with devastating honesty, performing his own autopsy night after night on stage. It was collaboration as codependency, art as intervention, neither of which could save anyone. The early success should have been thrilling. Instead, it was terrifying. Layne was deeply introverted, uncomfortable with attention, allergic to the performative aspects of fame. He wanted to make music, not be a rock star. Fame sells confession as entertainment, but the industry doesn't work that way. Success meant tours, interviews, photo shoots, playing the part, and Layne, unlike many of his peers, couldn't fake it. He was pathologically honest, even when honesty destroyed him. Behind all that power, was there an unbearable fragility that nobody saw? In 1992, Alice in Chains released Dirt, an album that would become the definitive text of grunge darkness. While Nirvana was channeling anger and Pearl Jam was finding anthems in alienation, Alice in Chains was doing something darker. They were documenting addiction, depression, and self-destruction in real time. Because by the time Dirt was released, Layne was already deep into heroin addiction. Not experimenting, not dabbling, addicted. The songs on Dirt weren't metaphors. When Layne sang about being angry, about wanting to die, about feeling worthless and trapped, he wasn't performing, he was reporting. The album's first track set the tone. A song about self-loathing so complete it became almost transcendent. Song after song detailed the experience of addiction, the shame, the desperation, the way drugs work until they don't, the knowledge that you're killing yourself coupled with the inability to stop. Critics called it brilliant. Fans connected with it deeply. The applause drowned out the warning. Drugs worked for me for years, he would later say, and now they're killing me. That was Layne in a sentence, brutally honest about his addiction, aware of exactly what was happening, and unable to escape despite knowing the ending. The relationship between art and suffering became impossible to separate. Was the music great because of the addiction or despite it? Would Layne have been this honest, this powerful, without heroin? These are questions he grappled with, questions his friends tortured themselves with, questions that have no good answers. What's certain is that by 1992, Layne Staley was both at the peak of his artistic powers and the beginning of his long, slow descent into death. Layne's creative process was meticulous despite, or perhaps because of, his addiction. He kept notebooks filled with lyrics, sketches, observations about the world. Friends who saw these notebooks described them as windows into a brilliant, tortured mind. He would spend hours on a single line, searching for the exact word that captured what he was feeling. Perfectionism in someone slowly killing themselves is its own kind of tragedy. caring deeply about art while caring nothing for the artist. He wrote most naturally in darkness, late at night when the world was quiet and his demons were loudest. The songs that made him famous were often written in states of extreme emotion, withdrawal, high grief, brief moments of clarity between the fog. He didn't write about drugs to glorify them. He wrote about them the way war correspondents write about battlefields, as someone in the middle of it reporting what he saw, unable to look away. Between the release of Dirt and Demry's death, Layne briefly found another outlet for his creativity. In 1994, while Alice in Chains was on hiatus, he formed Mad Season with Pearl Jam's Mike McCready, Screaming Trees drummer Barrett Martin, and bassist John Baker Saunders. The project was explicitly created by and for addicts. All four members were struggling with various substances, and the music reflected that shared understanding. The Mad Season album Above, released in 1995, captured something different from Alice in Chains. Where Alice was heavy and aggressive, Mad Season was melancholic and introspective. Layne's vocals on songs like River of Deceit showed a different side of his artistry, more vulnerable, less armored, the sound of someone genuinely searching for a way out rather than documenting the descent. But Mad Season was brief. John Baker Saunders would die of a heroin overdose in 1999, another casualty of the Seattle scene's dark underbelly. The project that was supposed to be about mutual support became another reminder that addiction doesn't care about good intentions or artistic brotherhood. Seattle in the 90s was losing its prophets one by one, and everyone who remained was just waiting to see who would be next. The heroin epidemic in Seattle during this period was devastating and largely invisible to those outside the scene. While grunge was being celebrated globally as a musical revolution, the artists creating it were dying from the same drug that powered much of the creativity. Layne was far from alone in his struggle. Kurt Cobain, Andrew Wood, Stephanie Sargent, John Baker Saunders, and others all fell to addiction. But Layne's decline was unique in its duration. Where others died quickly, dramatically, Layne died slowly, visibly over years. His mother, Nancy McCallum, tried everything to save him. She organized interventions, threatened to cut him off financially, begged him to enter rehab, showed up at his apartment demanding he get help. Layne would promise to try, would sometimes even check into treatment facilities only to leave after a few days or weeks. The disease was stronger than maternal love, stronger than his own desire to live, stronger than anything except maybe the guilt he carried about Demry. Nancy later spoke about the helplessness of watching your child die in slow motion. She described the Layne who existed before drugs, funny, creative, kind, full of dreams, and the shell he became after. She talked about the phone calls where she couldn't tell if he was high or sober, the visits where he looked like a stranger, the final years where he wouldn't see her at all. A mother's grief is private and infinite, and Nancy carried hers with a dignity that Layne would have appreciated. Then came Demry Lara Parrott. She entered Layne's life like weather, inevitable, transformative, ultimately devastating. They met in the Seattle scene, two people who recognized each other's damage and mistook it for compatibility. Demry was beautiful, troubled, and like Layne, fighting a losing battle with heroin. They became inseparable, two addicts convincing each other they could manage, that their love was stronger than their drugs, that somehow they would be different. In the early days, before the addiction consumed everything, there were moments of genuine joy. Layne would write songs for her, play guitar in their apartment while she listened. They would stay up all night talking about art and music and dreams that felt possible in those pre-dawn hours. Friends remember them as deeply devoted to each other, finishing each other's sentences, existing in a private world that no one else could quite penetrate. But addiction doesn't respect love. It consumes everything in its path, turning intimacy into enabling, care into codependency. Demry and Layne began using together, convincing themselves they could control it. that their love made them special, exempt from the laws that govern normal addicts. They were wrong, but by the time they realized it, addiction had already rewritten their story. Layne wrote about her constantly, not always naming her, but she was there in every song about love and loss, every lyric about trying to hold on to something while it slips away. She was his muse in the most tragic sense, the person who inspired his art while also participating in his destruction. Years later, people would analyze those songs, finding beauty in the poetry, missing the desperate truth underneath. Friends watched with mounting horror as Layne and Demry enabled each other's addictions. They weren't the romantic junkies of mythology. They loved like people who knew the ending and kept reading anyway. But there was love there, genuine and deep. The kind that makes tragedy inevitable because it's built on a foundation that's already crumbling. Did this tragic event mark their downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? In October 1996, Demry died from bacterial endocarditis, an infection caused by dirty needles. She was 27 years old. Layne, who had been told repeatedly that they would both die if they didn't stop, now had empirical proof. The woman he loved was gone, killed by the same drug that was killing him, and he was still here, still using, still unable to stop. She died of infection, he died of survival. The grief shattered something fundamental in Layne. Before Demry's death, there had been attempts at sobriety, glimpses of hope, moments where it seemed possible he might survive. After her death, that possibility disappeared. Friends described him as already dead, a ghost haunting his own life, going through motions until his body caught up with where his spirit had gone. Alice in Chains released one more album with Layne on vocals, an acoustic EP that would become legendary. The performance was haunting, Layne's voice raw and exposed without the protection of heavy guitars. One song in particular would become his epitaph, a meditation on loneliness so profound it felt like prophecy. The MTV Unplugged performance in 1996 was filmed just months after Demry's death. Anyone who watches it now can see Layne was barely holding on. He wore sunglasses throughout, not as a rock star affectation, but as a barrier between himself and the world. His body was already wasting away, his face gaunt, his movements careful as if he might break. But when he sang, something else emerged. A voice still capable of devastating beauty, now filtered through even more pain than before. The band had to convince him to do the show. He didn't want to perform, didn't think he could make it through. They rehearsed minimally. Jerry Cantrell later said it felt like they were holding Layne together with hope and determination. Knowing it might be the last time they played together, it was. During the performance, Layne barely moved. He stood at the microphone, gripping it like a lifeline, singing songs about pain and isolation and death with an audience watching his slow disintegration in real time. The applause between songs sounded like mockery. People celebrating art made from a man dying in front of them. But Layne had always understood this paradox, that his suffering was entertainment, that his honesty was a product, that the same people who loved his music couldn't or wouldn't save him from what created it. One particular moment haunts anyone who's seen the footage. Layne singing about feeling alone, his voice breaking not from technique but from truth, tears visible even behind the sunglasses. It wasn't a performance. It was a public goodbye disguised as a concert. The performance was filmed, and watching it now is like watching a man say goodbye in real time, using the only language he trusted, music. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? After that performance, Layne began his slow disappearance from public life. He turned down tours, refused interviews, stopped showing up to band practice. His bandmates, Jerry Cantrell especially, tried everything. Interventions, pleas, anger, nothing worked. Layne had made his decision even if he couldn't articulate it. He was done fighting. He moved into a condominium in Seattle's University District and essentially never left. The apartment became his world, shrinking year by year until it was just him and his addictions and the ghosts of everyone he'd lost. Friends who visited described a scene from horror: blackout curtains covering every window, trash piling up, Layne skeletal and barely recognizable, surrounded by drugs and isolation. He had built a tomb and climbed inside while still breathing. Every fix was a brick, every song another shovelful of dirt. The daily routine of his isolation was heartbreaking in its mundanity. He would order food delivery, leaving notes about where to leave it, never answering the door. He played video games for hours, Star Wars games mostly, losing himself in fictional galaxies where he could be anyone but Layne Staley. He watched television, the flicker of the screen the only light in the apartment. He used drugs methodically, mechanically, no longer chasing a high, but just maintaining. Staying in the narrow space between withdrawal and overdose. Friends would call. Sometimes he'd answer, his voice barely recognizable. Not just physically diminished, but somehow hollow. As if the person they'd known had already left and what remained was just echoes. He would talk about Demry, about missing her, about waiting to join her. They would beg him to get help, to come out, to try again. He would agree non-committally, and then not answer the phone for weeks. Jerry Cantrell tried hardest and suffered most from his inability to save Layne. They had been brothers, creatively and personally, for over a decade. Jerry had written songs about Layne's addiction, hoping music might break through. He had organized interventions, offered to pay for treatment, threatened to walk away if Layne didn't get clean. Nothing worked. Watching someone you love destroy themselves is its own form of dying, and Jerry was dying alongside Layne, just more slowly. The few people who saw Layne in those final years describe him as barely present, physically there but spiritually absent, going through the motions of existence without actually living. He had lost most of his teeth from drug use and malnutrition. He weighed less than 100 pounds, his body consuming itself for fuel. But he was still Layne, still capable of moments of humor and kindness between the darkness, still the person his friends had loved before addiction had claimed him completely. There are specific stories from these final years that friends share, painful in their mundanity. A bandmate who brought him groceries and found him playing the same video game level over and over, unable to progress but unable to stop trying. A friend who called and spent an hour on the phone while Layne said almost nothing, just breathing on the other end, the sound of someone drowning who couldn't ask for a life preserver. Another friend who managed to visit and found Layne apologizing repeatedly for his appearance, for the state of the apartment, for being alive when Demry wasn't. The guilt about surviving Demry consumed him as thoroughly as the drugs. He talked about it constantly in those rare conversations. How it should have been him. How he deserved to die more than she did. How he was just waiting for the courage to join her. Friends tried to tell him this was the addiction talking, that Demry wouldn't have wanted this, that his life still had value. He would agree politely, the way you agree with someone when you know they're wrong but lack the energy to argue. Jerry Cantrell struggled with whether to keep trying or let Layne go. He wrote more songs, hoping music might break through where words couldn't. He threatened to disband Alice in Chains, thinking maybe losing the band would shake Layne into action. He showed up at the apartment, pounding on the door, demanding Layne let him in. Sometimes Layne would open the door. More often he wouldn't. And Jerry was left standing in a hallway, helpless, listening to silence on the other side of a door, wondering if his best friend was even still breathing. The last time Jerry saw Layne was months before his death. Layne had agreed to meet, a rare concession. Jerry later said it was like talking to a ghost. Layne was there physically, but everything that made him Layne seemed to have already left. They talked about music, about old times, carefully avoiding the obvious topic. When Jerry left, he knew it was probably the last time. He was right. The world outside moved on. Grunge became history. Kurt Cobain died in 1994. The 90s ended. The new millennium arrived, and Layne Staley remained in his apartment, growing smaller, quieter, more absent. Friends would call. Sometimes he'd answer, his voice barely a whisper of the instrument that had made him famous. Mostly, he wouldn't answer at all. "I know I'm dying," he told a friend during one rare conversation. "I'm just waiting for it to be official." Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? The question doesn't quite apply to Layne because by the end he wasn't making decisions in any real sense. He was simply existing in the space between life and death, too addicted to live, too scared to die, trapped exactly as his music had always described. His final years remained somewhat mysterious. He saw almost no one. He ordered food delivery, never answering the door, leaving notes about where to leave things. Delivery drivers and neighbors occasionally glimpsed him, a skeletal figure, barely recognizable as the man who had once commanded stages. He played video games, watched television, used drugs, waited. For what? Death, presumably. Or maybe just for time to pass, since passing time was all he could do. He did small things that suggested some part of him still cared about the world. He sent hand-drawn postcards to fans who wrote to him, signing them Love L. He kept a photograph of Demry where he could see it. He collected Lego sets because, as he once said, Lego doesn't betray you. These tiny gestures of humanity persisting in someone who had essentially already died. Even ghosts crave routine. His final years remained somewhat mysterious. He saw almost no one. He ordered food delivery, never answering the door, leaving notes about where to leave things. Delivery drivers and neighbors occasionally glimpsed him, a skeletal figure barely recognizable as the man who had once commanded stages. He played video games, watched television, used drugs, waited. For what? Death, presumably. Or maybe just for time to pass, since passing time was all he could do. On or around April 5, 2002, Layne Staley died. The exact time is unknown. He was alone, as he had been for years. When police finally entered the apartment 2 weeks later, they found a scene that told the story of his final days. The gaming console still running Star Wars, shadows of the Empire, the television flickering, Demry's photograph watching over everything. Empty syringes, drug paraphernalia, the detritus of a life that had shrunk to a single room. Medical examiners estimated he had been dead for approximately 2 weeks before his body was discovered. 2 weeks where the phone rang and no one answered. 2 weeks where delivery drivers left food outside a door that never opened. 2 weeks where Seattle went about its business, unaware that one of its prophets had finally fallen silent. The specifics of his death are less important than the totality of it. A man who had spent years preparing for this moment finally arrived at it. His body, ravaged by years of drug abuse, simply stopped. The man who had sung about dying young, about being buried alive, about darkness consuming light, had finally made good on every prophecy. Was their death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Layne's case, there was no mystery, no conspiracy. His death was the inevitable conclusion to a story that had been writing itself for over a decade. Heroin doesn't kill fast. It erases in daily doses. Medical terms for a tragedy everyone saw coming but couldn't prevent. What makes Layne's death particularly devastating is how long it took. He didn't die young in the romantic sense, 27 like so many others. He died at 34, but he had been dying for years, slowly disappearing while everyone watched. His death wasn't sudden trauma. It was slow erosion. The world didn't lose Layne Staley on April 5, 2002. It lost him gradually, piece by piece, until what remained was just a body in a darkened room. The funeral began long before the body was found. What hidden secrets might still remain untold behind their public image? After his death, friends and family revealed the extent of his isolation and suffering. But they also revealed his kindness. The anonymous donations to addiction charities, the supportive notes to fans struggling with similar demons, the loyalty to friends even when he couldn't save himself. Layne Staley was not a cautionary tale about drugs. He was a human being who suffered from addiction and depression, who made art from his pain, and who ultimately succumbed to illnesses that medicine still struggles to treat. The legacy of Layne Staley is complicated. Musically, he's indisputable. One of the greatest rock vocalists of his generation, a voice that could convey more emotion in a single note than most singers achieve in entire careers. His influence is everywhere in modern rock. Every band that sings honestly about depression, addiction, or despair is walking a path Layne helped create. Artists from Maynard James Keenan of Tool to Chester Bennington of Linkin Park to countless others in the nu metal, post-grunge, and alternative rock scenes have cited Layne as an influence, not just vocally, but in his approach to honesty and songwriting. But his influence is also a warning that art made from suffering can be both transcendent and fatal, that authenticity has limits, that you can't pour yourself into music forever without eventually running empty. Chester Bennington, who admired Layne deeply and struggled with similar demons, would also die by his own hand in 2017, another voice silenced by the weight of feeling too much. The conversation about addiction and mental health in rock music changed after Layne's death, though perhaps not enough. His friends and bandmates began speaking more openly about the need for better support systems, for destigmatizing treatment, for understanding that addiction is a disease, not a moral failing. Jerry Cantrell has spoken at addiction awareness events, turning his grief into advocacy. But no amount of awareness brings Layne back. And that's the cruel mathematics of loss. In the years since his death, previously unreleased recordings have emerged, giving fans glimpses of Layne in different creative moments. Demos, live recordings, collaborations that never saw official release. Each one is a reminder of what was lost. Not just a voice, but a mind constantly creating, constantly trying to make sense of pain through art. The recordings are treasured by fans, but they're also ghosts, proof that talent and genius can't save you when the darkness becomes too heavy to carry. Chris Cornell wrote a song after Layne's death, a meditation on mortality and the holes we leave behind. Eddie Vedder spoke about him with reverence tinged with survivor's guilt. Jerry Cantrell, who had been Layne's closest musical partner, continues to perform Alice in Chains songs, but he'll never sing them the way Layne did. No one can. That voice is gone, and with it something irreplaceable. In Seattle, there's a wall where fans have written messages to Layne. No official memorial, no plaque, just graffiti that appears and gets painted over and reappears. We miss you, Layne. Thank you for the music. You're not alone anymore. It's anonymous, informal, and somehow more appropriate than anything official could be. Layne didn't want monuments. He just wanted to be understood. The question that haunts Layne Staley's story is whether it could have been different, with better treatment, with different choices, with less honest art. These questions torture his friends and fans, but they may be the wrong questions. Layne was who he was, pathologically honest, deeply sensitive, unable to perform happiness he didn't feel. That honesty made his music transcendent. It also made his life unbearable. Every generation buries a prophet in the same soil that grew his songs. Perhaps the lesson of Layne Staley isn't that he should have been different, but that the world should be different. A world with better addiction treatment, with less stigma around mental health, with more understanding that sensitivity is not weakness and honesty is not self-indulgence. Layne died in 2002, but the systems and attitudes that failed him are still failing people today. "I wrote songs to feel alive," he once said, "not to be famous." And he did feel alive in the music. You can hear it in every performance, every recording. But between songs, in the silence of hotel rooms and tour buses, and eventually that darkened apartment, the aliveness faded. Music gave him moments of transcendence, but couldn't sustain him through the hours between those moments. His final note, found after his death, mentioned Demry. After 6 years, he was still mourning her, still feeling responsible, still unable to imagine a life without the person who had understood him best and enabled him worst. Some loves don't end when people die. Some grief doesn't heal. Layne carried Demry with him until he could finally join her, wherever it is that broken people go when they stop hurting. The man in the box, buried in his shame, finally broke free. Not into light. Layne never sang about light, never pretended redemption was coming. He broke free into silence, which is what he'd been searching for all along. Not happiness, not success. Just the absence of pain, the quiet after the screaming stops. How much truth can one person carry before truth becomes unbearable? And when your gift is turning pain into beauty, what happens when the pain runs out of beautiful ways to express itself? Layne Staley spent his life answering these questions, and the answers killed him. He mistook self-dissection for art because we kept applauding the bleeding. He sang about being alone until he was alone. He sang about dying young until he died young. He sang about darkness until darkness was all that remained. The tragedy is that he was right about everything, and being right didn't save him. The music remains, of course. The albums that documented his descent, the performances that captured his power, the songs that continue to speak to people who feel unseen, unheard, buried alive in their own lives. Layne's voice hasn't aged because voices on recordings don't age. It's forever 34, forever powerful, forever honest. But honesty at that level comes with a cost. Layne paid it fully in ways that destroyed him slowly and publicly while everyone watched and no one could intervene effectively. His death was both shocking and inevitable. Shocking because we always hope the story will end differently. Inevitable because Layne had been writing this ending since he first picked up a microphone. In the end, perhaps the kindest interpretation is that Layne Staley found the only peace available to him. Not through recovery or redemption, those narratives belong to different stories, but through the simple act of stopping the fight, stopping the performance, stopping the pain. The man who sang about wanting to die finally got what he wanted, and we're left with the music and the questions and the unbearable sadness of a talent extinguished too soon. Maybe heaven sounds like feedback through an empty hall, the echo of a voice that finally doesn't have to mean anything. Seattle still mourns him. The grunge generation still feels his absence. Anyone who has ever felt too much, hurt too deeply, or struggled to keep living when living hurts, they still find themselves in his music, still hear their own pain reflected back to them in that haunting voice. Layne Staley didn't want to be remembered as a rock star. He wanted to be remembered as someone who told the truth. He got his wish. The truth he told was dark and difficult and ultimately fatal. But it was truth, and in a world full of lies, that matters. The television flickered in that darkened apartment. The game console hummed. The photograph of Demry watched over a man who had finally found the silence he'd been seeking since he was a boy in rainy Washington, feeling things too deeply and needing music to survive. The silence won, the way it always does. But before it did, Layne Staley gave us music that will outlast us all. Beautiful, honest, unbearably sad and real. Some voices are meant to shake the world. Layne's did, and when it stopped, the world was quieter for it, which is exactly what he would have wanted. Not celebration, not glorification, just the quiet after the screaming stops. The peace that comes when you finally stop fighting yourself. The end that looks like the beginning of every song he ever wrote. He died in a box he built himself. But his voice escaped, and it's still out there, still singing, still connecting with people who need to hear that someone else felt this way too. that they are not alone in their darkness. Layne would probably find it ironic that his death couldn't silence him, that the man who spent his final years in isolation created music that breaks isolation for others. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any artist can ask for. To create something that outlasts the pain of creating it, to connect with people across time and space, to turn suffering into something that helps others suffer less. Layne Staley did that. He paid the ultimate price for it, but he did it. The rain still falls in Seattle. The music still plays. And somewhere in a darkened apartment that no longer exists, a voice still sings about being buried alive, about choosing darkness, about the beautiful agony of feeling too much. The man is gone. The truth remains. And the truth, as Layne knew better than anyone, never dies. It just waits in the darkness for someone brave enough or broken enough to speak it out loud.